Good evening, everyone, and you're very, very welcome to this evening's event, which is the latest in the uh, community tree nursery collaborative um, series of webinars, and the CTNC is a project. Peer-to-peer network learning project hosted by Fellowship of the Trees and funded by Norfolk County Council, and basically brings together community tree nursery practitioners and those interested in CTNs, basically to share knowledge, and that's why we're here this evening. Uh, Tonight's presentation is on biochar. We're very, very lucky indeed to have with us Mark Shipperlee, who's going to speak on unlocking the benefits of biochar for CTNs. Mark, many of you may know him. He has spoken before. The last time he was on with us speaking about permaculture, and this time it's going to be a focus on biochar. Mark says he started his biochar journey in 2014, has been producing and using it on his own land. As I said, he is a permaculture practitioner, so I'm sure he'd probably incorporate some of that in. And he studied biochar as well with the school food web, soil school food web school. So yeah, there will be an option or an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. Do please, any questions you have, keep them till then. Feel free to pop them into the chat, and that way I can gather them all together and we'll deal with them at the end. Then I see someone's asking if there's a link to the rest of the webinars. I am happy to share that once Mark gets started. I'll pop that into the chat. As I say, do please add any questions into the chat. And yeah, without any further ado, I will pass over to Mark to hear about unlocking the benefits of biochar for community tree nurseries. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, John, and welcome everybody to a new year, which is an interesting new year already. I'm pleased to be here. Biochar's been an interesting journey for me for a while, and it seems to be hotting up in the news again as we chase various things to tackle climate change. But for me, it started as a different sort of journey, primarily about soil. So I'm just going to share my screen, and we'll go through things. Okay, so thanks, John, for the introduction. Yeah, this is really about biochar. It's an interesting thing. It's a bit of a mythical beast. It's been a challenge. It causes interesting arguments in the charcoal industry. But I believe it has some real purposes around what it is. What I've done is I actually spoke at a global soil summit on this, and interestingly, about 4 or 5 years ago. And so some of that has been endorsed into this, but actually there's been recent developments and changes. So it's all very exciting, and I think hopeful, and we can benefit from it within the community tree nurseries as well. Oh, sorry, it's gone back. Yeah, I'll skip. I was going to introduce myself. I'm a director of Living Woods, which is a non-profit based in the northeast of England. We have bits of tree nursery work going on, but I've also been involved with using biochar in my own food growing, which is where it really started to try and understand what was happening there. I don't like being called an expert anyway. Thank you, John, for not doing that. I think this is a learning game for a lot of people, and I'm definitely not a researcher. I'm definitely not a bulk producer or a marketeer. I'm somebody that has a little go at stuff and has seen some amazing results. And being a woodland manager and woodland worker, I think biochar is a great product as we seek to try and get as much out of the trees that we fell as we can.
Sorry, Mark, to jump in. If you could stop that
Yep.
WeTransfer at any point if it's still running, just because your video is freezing up a little bit.
How is it? I don't think it, how do I check that?
Don't worry for now. It's fine.
I think I stopped it. So anyway, so biochar has an interesting history. Um, it was originally a phrase called terra preta, coming out of the Amazon rainforest. If you know much about the rainforest, the indigenous peoples would cut small glades to grow their food in, whether it's cassava, just trying to make a bit of a living. But the nice thing was is they'd work a piece of land, use the materials to build houses, and they ended up with a lot of surplus of everything. And just to be tidy, they used to burn everything, and so they'd burn a lot of their waste. They weren't particularly composters, as we understand it. And this created great pits of what appears to have been a thing called terra preta. And it appears to have been a really magic thing. Some of the invaders, the people that came over, basically suggested that there were an awful lot of people living in that part of the world at that time, and obviously living in a forest in jungles it's quite tricky, so they had to look after themselves. And there's a guy from the University of Kansas who actually said this stuff improves itself. So what we're talking about today actually isn't yet terra preta, and maybe that's the magic of the journey that we've all got to do. But it is something about improving our soils. But it appears that if we get it absolutely right, the same way as in the Amazon rainforest, it will affect the soils next to it and make soils better by themselves. So it's a really interesting concept. There's been a new thirst for biochar. Well, I guess we're on the second loop of it now. When I looked at this slide originally, around 2010, 2015, it started to appear for sale in garden centres. It was shown on TV. Classically, Monty Don used it for one season, but didn't particularly feedback on it in Gardener's World. You may have come across Carbon Gold, sold by a mate of mine, and lots of research programs and networks were set up around the world. As you can see, we did have the UK Biochar Research Centre based up in Edinburgh. That's sort of gone a bit quiet in terms of certainly wood-based biochar, and the British Biochar Foundation at this point is a bit quiet. But there's more networks happening. We had a big workshop with 4 or 5 researchers up here last summer, and the books keep coming out. So this is some of the early books that came out. Burn was one of the significant ones, and another one's just come out, a biochar handbook written by an American called Kelpie Wilson, who's got some really interesting stories. And there are thousands of scientific papers now on all sorts of areas around biochar. So there's a big chase on. Now, why on earth should we have a big chase around biochar? So my own journey, just to give you a little bit about it, I heard about it from a friend, and they had this makeshift machine called a carbon catcher, which was a design. There was a gathering in 2014 in Oxford where lots of people wanted to get together around biochar and were looking at designs. And this was one of the designs, a carbon catcher, a very simple rudimentary system where you fill it full of a wood chip, you ignite it in limited oxygen, and then when the burner's finished, you let it all out, and hey presto, you end up with a charcoal. And then we have to decide whether that charcoal is a biochar or not. The carbon catcher, also known as the puffless billy, was a simple design, but it was what's called batch processing, which means you just fill it up and off it goes. We were more interested in a design that came out of Switzerland called the Contiki kiln. And this is our Contiki kiln, shiny new on the left, and well used and loved now. And the idea of this is you can keep filling it as you go along. So it's what's known as continuous feed process rather than a batch process. So it's a much easier way to work with things. The Contikas are available. You can buy the small one commercially and the large one commercially. And as we did, you could pay a donation for open source drawings for the middle size one. So this is about 1.2 meters across, 1.2 meters across. Fairly handleable, nice medium sized machine. And we wanted to know what happened. We wanted to see what would happen in beds. And obviously the easiest thing to start, rather than starting with trees, which are harder to measure, is to actually look at what's going on in annual vegetable beds. And I had the good fortune that I had separate raised. On the right here, we also trialed with potatoes in pots, just to try and get an idea of what was going on and what was happening differently. So what is it? So the whole idea of charring is you're not actually burning something completely because you're starving a large amount of the oxygen. You're actually not letting it get in there. It's what they call chars. So it becomes a black substance ideally. And it doesn't just have to be wood. You can see a list on the right there: hemp, corn, pellets, pelletized sludge, all sorts of things. My focus has always been about wood because you've got a lot of material coming out of the woodland, but you've got a lot of brash that at times you can chip it. But is there another product that we can make out of it? It's too small to go into traditional charcoal kilns, but actually, is there something else we could do? And that's really where we were seeking biochar, how that could work. So is it just charcoal? This is traditional charcoal kiln making charcoal. Yes, charcoal is burnt in reduced oxygen, often in old ring kilns traditionally, more often now in what's called retorts, much more healthy environments. It's been a tradition for years. My debate partly around charcoal and biochar. One of the things is about what you're using to make it and also the size of the final product. And for me, for annual veg and stuff like that, biochar should be quite a small thing. An initial feedstock, I don't want to be wasting things that could be used for barbecue charcoal or could be used for firewood or bean rods. We're looking at the material that's left over on the forest floor that really we couldn't do that much with. So this is the difference between a Contiki on the left and a traditional ring kiln on the right. So if you know charcoal making in a ring kiln, you stack up, this is our ring kiln, it's a big one, you stack it up full of charcoal and then you have 6 ports around the bottom on our size of machine. And those ports either allow air in or they draw smoke out. And the whole thing is sealed off with sand around the top as well. So the only air coming in is through those ports in the bottom. So that is definitely a reduced form of burning. And so you're getting that char. What happens with the Contiki is it's actually an open wok-like thing. It's got a flat bottom, but because the air has to be pulled in going downwards through the sides, it means it's a trickier burn, and therefore there's less oxygen around. And it also introduces a process called pyrolysis, which is where we start to burn off wood gases. And this is where we start to look at the difference between charcoal and biochar. So in charcoal, we want what's called volatiles in the charcoal still for when we're cooking because it helps make a good charcoal fire. If you looked at the charcoal in microscopic things, it's full of small pores, as is the biochar, but mostly in charcoal, those pores are full of various alkaline products. In biochar, the part of the idea is to make sure we're getting good sized pores to serve the purposes we need for it, which we'll go on to. But also we quench it, which means it cleans those pores through. And this pyrolysis process, because we're cooking at a higher temperature, maybe 500 degrees, that means that a lot of the volatiles that would normally stay in a cooking charcoal are lost. They don't stay around, and because we don't really want those volatiles and like wood oils and wood gases and stuff, we don't want those going back into the soil as a biochar. So it's known as a soil improver, but technically it's not really a soil improver. I'd describe it as it's more of a soil structure improver. When we drop it in the soil, it's producing millions and millions of passageways, huge surface areas. They describe a teaspoon of biochar has the same surface area as a football pitch. And if you think about it, what we've said is that we want to quench it because we want to open the pores up. We want to make it at the right temperature so we get the right size pores to allow things to flow through. And that's the whole concept of it. We're looking at how we can create habitats for small creatures. If we're looking at the microorganisms, we're looking at how it could hold bacteria, maybe amoeba, other things, creating a whole habitat within the soil there. We're also looking at what it does with liquids, whether it's nutrients or whether it's water. And so this is biochar under a microscope or electron microscope on the left and in the middle, and this is a standard piece of it on the right. You can still see the annual rings because it's been charred and not burnt through. So one of the concepts is that carbon obviously is a very strong material. And so while 5, 6 years ago, even 10 years ago, we were thinking it was good for the soil, actually one of the main things that's come to the fore now is actually about locking down carbon or sequestering carbon, because that's what we're trying to do, whether we're protecting the peat bogs or we're coppicing or locking down carbon dioxide in mysterious ways in under the sea and in mines. It's all now about how we hold on to the carbon that we've got. And so it's a very strong product. They say it will last 10,000 years, but actually we're looking a while because new research would suggest that not all carbon is the same. But as I mentioned earlier, it's all about the magic it can do in the soil. If you think about feeding your tomatoes in the summer, I use comfrey, maybe use a commercial product like Tomerite. Imagine you're just putting that feed around the roots of your tomatoes. How much is actually held there, and how much just disappears through deeper into the soil and is gone? As we know, tomato roots aren't that deep. So one of the things that biochar can assist with is by grabbing hold of those nutrients and then releasing them more slowly. And it's the same thing that they do with water as well. And this is where we start to see benefits for tree nurseries. Imagine you have a clay soil. We know clay soil, it's a pain in the neck. We tend to have to break the pan on it so that we can get water to go through it. Oak tree roots will go through it, but not a lot of others. And so actually, if we have a solid clay soil, we're going to end up with waterlogged areas if we're not careful. So imagine if you had biochar mixed into that. Suddenly there's little passageways that water and air and nutrients can get into and move through. And suddenly your issue of the problems of clay go away. It's suddenly made a lot easier because the water can move through it. Imagine if you're on a ridiculously sandy soil. My dad had a garden. My mum and dad had a garden which was pretty pure sand, right next door to a sand pit. The water cannot get hold at all. So how do you hold the soil and the water in the soil? If you add biochar, because there's not much there, it'll want to hold on to that and not let it flow through. And that's part of the magic that we had originally before the whole idea of sequestering carbon. The whole thing was, how do we manage water and therefore nutrients around our annual plants? It can be made a range of ways. I talked about our Kontiki, the original earth pits in the Amazon rainforest. They just appeared to be trenches, and literally they threw their food waste and maybe human remains even in there, and human waste as well. You can get oil barrel sized, you can get shipping container sized, you can now get 38-ton truck sized biochar makers with air curtains on. That's the green one in the middle. So there's lots of different ways of making it. I'd put myself at somewhere sort of bit higher than the oil barrels, but there's lots of videos out there where you can use oil barrels. The main disadvantage is that you're only going to get 4 or 5 burns if you're getting the heat right. And like 10 years ago when we first started, the temperature of what was going on inside the kiln wasn't particularly important as far as we were concerned. Everyone's just looking at the product at the end, but that's shifted a little bit now. So the Kontiki had the advantage for us that we could load it through the day. It also had a rim shield around the outside, which allowed it warm air to draw up the rim shield and fold into the fire, and then it pushed the wood gases down, and then that's forced them into what's called pyrolysis, and that's what you see the dancing flames in that left-hand picture. They're burning above the fire. You can see where it's starting to ash a bit, starting to go white. At that point, we'd put more wood on top of it to starve the oxygen again. That pyrolysis is getting rid of all of the bad stuff that we don't want, the toxins and the volatiles and that sort of thing. But it's also creating a much higher temperature. This, for us, we could produce about 700 litres in 7 to 8 hours, and you could see what you're doing. It was a great system. The main disadvantage is that we weren't utilising the heat that was coming off it. So the heat within it was great. The heat coming off the top was superb. But ethically, when I'm looking at things, I wanted to really think about how we could utilise heat. And we haven't really got hold of that, because you put a cap on it, you spoil the whole process. It just doesn't work the same. So this is the pyrolysis. You can see the burning off the gases quite clearly here. That's actually a small one on the right, a smaller one than ours, and you can see the rim shield around the outside. So you start with a small fire in the bottom, quite tricky to get started. We tend to build a small fire and lower it in on a fork because the oxygen has to be drawn in from the top. So you need the warmth to start working to make it happen. But then you get going like this, and every time you see some white ash, you throw some more of your material, your feedstock material on, and you get this wonderful process and this dancing, and hopefully you get a very clear burn with not a lot of steam if you've used dry wood, and also not much of the wood smoke coming out that you would get with a traditional kiln. We emphasised, which is where we clashed a lot with some of the charcoal people that wanted to just sell small charcoal. Partly it's safety, because if you drive along the road with a trailer full of charcoal that's just been made, that you have a risk that it could reignite because it's being fed oxygen. So quenching is partly about that. But for us, it was also about quenching it to clear out those pores, to make all those tiny little channels available and open. They say when you quench it, if you that water becomes quite alkaline. So those are the things that are coming out, maybe potassiums, lithiums, these sorts of things. Various alkalines were coming out, and potash would be a classic. So in charcoal at a low temperature, you'll get a lot of those pores filled with stuff. Quenching on a high temperature means you get a much cleaner product. So we did some trials in the early days, and I describe it as untreated. We didn't add anything to the biochar. We just put it in the ground, which we now realise probably isn't the best view, but that's how we started. But you can see some of the successful results here. We did it with tomatoes in the first year, and the second year we did it with broad beans, and we did it with cucumbers. And interesting on the right here, this is an accidental droughting test. So we were looking after a mate's polytunnel, or we had some tomatoes in there. The door was accidentally left closed, and it got very, very hot in the polytunnel for a day. You can see the plants on the right have biochar mixed into the grow bag, and the plants on the left didn't. And you can see quite a simple thing. So what was happening is the biochar was holding on to the moisture that was in there rather than releasing it too quickly into the atmosphere as the polytunnel warmed up. I said we put it in raw or untreated. It would appear that there are some problems with a lot of things that go into the soil about how they exchange and compete for nutrients. And this was one of the things with biochar. Biochar is obviously very carbon rich. So if you put it into the soil, is it going to rob it of the nitrogen? It's like the whole concept of wood chip and whether you put wood chip in your beds. That's what RCW is. That's ramial chipped wood, which is a new style of operating, putting wood chip in. I use wood chip in the garden, but I only put it on top of the bed so that it just reacts with the air. If you put it in the ground, that's when people tend to say they've seen their lettuce leaves or their potato leaves go yellow, and that means they're not getting the nitrogen they need. So maybe you need to think about what you could put into the biochar before you put it in the ground. And that's where we started putting comfrey liquid or mix it with worm teas, compost things. Comfrey liquid's a great one because you've got the nitrogen and the potassium as well. The nitrogen for leaf growth and the potassium for fruiting and flowering. So if you are using biochar, you really want to think about what you're going to put it in the soil with. And we don't recommend anymore that people put it in raw. But most of the time when we were selling it in small ways, we actually sold it untreated and said, it's up to you, go and look at it. Some people have the ability to mulch or make a seaweed feed. Others maybe have their own compost teas. So it becomes a bit of a carrier. So as I remind you, it's not a soil improver, but it's a soil structure improver, and it could be a good carrier for some of the nutrients that you might want to put in the soil. Sorry, this picture's a bit smaller than it should have been. So this was one of the exciting things that came out, that of all the different things that biochar could be. Could it be a source of renewable energy because it creates great heat? Could it mitigate against climate change because of locking soil down? Could it be a way of us getting rid of some of our waste products? I know that in Scotland and university there, they tried pelletized sludge from the water treatment works and tried charring that. And can it improve our soil? So this is why it builds up a bit of a picture of being magic if we really get it to work properly. So 10 years ago, the British Biochar Research Centre was doing most of the work out of Edinburgh University. They created a thing called a UK Biochar Quality Mandate, which was the idea of trying to get some law and order around quality so that people could understand what was a good biochar, what was maybe not such a good biochar. Very early days. Now, suddenly, there's a whole rise of universities looking at biochar again. But the change is in the focus now. Whereas it for us at the start, it was about soil improvement, it really is now about how we lock down carbon. And they're wanting to understand which biochar, what form of biochar is really good for locking down carbon. Because if we get to the stage of it being available for carbon credits by farmers putting on the land, we need to make sure it's doing the right thing. Current research is suggesting that if we're charring at 500 plus degrees C for at least an hour in each part of the kiln, then that's a good start. And this is in a recent experiment with a lot of thermocouplers in some of our biochar to see what we could get up to in that time. And we work with various students in university to try and this sort of thing. At low temperatures, carbon is not inert, it's not stable, and therefore it can have a negative in the soil and could produce other things. So we need to make sure that we are making it at the right temperature. And there's been a lot of hassle in terms of some of the charcoal makers. I'm part of the National Coppice Federation, and there's always discussion because it's been a great idea to be able to sell your small charcoal that's not big enough to cook with as a biochar and put it in the soil. But obviously it's not reaching 500 degrees, it's not being quenched. And we're having to try and muddle through and get a real clarification on what actually is a biochar to make sure that we're not having a negative effect on the planet, but we are actually locking it down as well as doing all the things in the soil that we feel benefits it. So what about us on Tree Nurseries? From what I've said, hopefully you're already realising, wow, that could be useful for us. Because if you think about it, any tree growing, any plants, we need to make sure that the soil level, our water, not too waterlogged, not too dry. And also, it's great if we can reduce our level of watering. So biochar gives you a tick for that. What's your soil like? Is it sandy or is it clay or is it a great loam? What are the issues around that? Again, biochar will serve a tick for that, for managing the nutrients. Support for microorganisms. A good biochar that's been clearly quenched and has given the opportunity for thousands of square meters of tiny surfaces for all sorts of sizes of creatures. We learn more and more about soil food web these days, and the critical thing about how bacteria need to be protected and hide, but because they're the ones that break up rock, they're the ones that are going to then feed into the rest of the soil food web. So we need to support, make sure we've got a soil structure that is good for that whole range of the soil food web going through. And of course, nutrient release and retention, like the water. If you are feeding trees, we don't always do it, but if your systems and not be available. So biochar can meet all those needs for us that we need in tree nurseries. And of course, it's locking down carbon. This is an exciting project actually over in Scandinavia. So biochar is quite strong, literally actually trying to break it. So when we make biochar that's too big, it's quite a complex process to work out how to break it down. We've tried chippers and shredders and tried driving over it with sort of Hilux trucks and just trying to make it break down. It's a good, strong, resistant material. And so the idea in Stockholm, you know, the traditional problem we have with trees and pavements that then cause a problem is the trees grow, the roots lift the paving slabs, and then it costs money and trees tend to get cut down in that process. Here, what they decided to of biochar and then sinking it down even further into the ground. And so this has been an urban thing that they've been using in Stockholm. You know, our cities are about 5 or 6 degrees hotter than our countryside. They want to see this as part of cooling the system because that whole biochar area could actually be holding water and then it could be evaporating and keeping the city cooler as well as supporting the tree. It also removes storm water because it's porous, so it will run through further down in the system. And as I said, it avoids the problem of broken and raised paving because the biochar just moves and supports the root system. So actually, that's quite an interesting project. I haven't got a chance to see it, but biochar. They're also looking at putting it into blocks, whether we can increase in building blocks, increase the thermal properties. But for us in the tree nursery, it's simply about how it can improve our soil structure. How it can be more purposeful, more served in our ways. I'm actually going to stop sharing the screen there because there's not much point really. So it's about where we can go in the future. It's looking very exciting. A big producer said, "Yeah, it's a whole new ball game now." And now the focus is about locking down carbon, not actually about soil so much. But obviously the soil is critical for us. We want the land to be producing a lot more. They talk about there's only 50 harvests left on the planet. The water distribution around the planet is difficult. We need to make sure that water can be managed in our soils, food can be grown, the whole biochar thing can come in. So I think really, sorry, it's been a bit disjointed that last bit there, but for me, it's just about in our tree nurseries, campuses to look after our trees, to provide good, maybe that we don't have to water so much, and we have a good quality soil around our trees. And I think really, because I don't want to go back through all the slides, so I think that's we'll leave it at that if that's okay, John, and then I'm happy to deal with any questions or involve any conversation because there's all sorts of myths. There's some unusual stories around biochar, and I'm just intrigued what people are thinking about, and obviously chose to come to this meeting tonight. So maybe we can have some questions.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Mark. That was a fascinating presentation and talk. And yeah, there seems to be quite a bit of interest in this topic, which is excellent. So yeah, if there's any more questions, do please pop them into the chat. I'm just going to start off with a few that were previously submitted. So yeah, I'll stick these into the chat and then I'll read them out for folks, and we can just go through them, and then I'll get stuck into the others. So yeah, do we know what the optimal size of biochar is? I think you've sort of addressed optimal size for symbiotic relationships and optimal size for soil structure.
Yeah, so I mean on for outside particle size, if we're doing stuff with annual food growing, we tend to do something like between 2 to 8 millimeters. In fact, Clansman, the main horticultural compost supplier for the UK from Germany, they're now looking at biochar as to whether it's one of the products that will reduce the amount of peat that's needed. And so they're going for very, very small. And for us, I think if we're going for larger trees, for apple trees and things like that, I'll put larger biochar in terms of the size of the pieces. So that will be from 8 to say 15 millimeter, and we try and break down below 15 millimeter. But the inside, the structure will be partly dependent on the timber material. So if you've got something as dense as hawthorn, it will be quite a small structure. If you've got something as wide open as willow, when you char it, you'll have a very different structure, and I suspect a very open pore system. I'm due to try some softwoods to see what that means, but you've got the complications of resin in the softwood that often affects the burn, so it makes it quite difficult. So you've got the two things that you want: the nice, clean, small pores inside, and most of our hardwoods would do that. So I think I saw someone mentioned rhododendron. That's obviously very dense. Anything that's a hot burner like oak or wych elm, rhododendron, these sorts of things, they create a lot of heat. It means they've probably got a very tight pore structure, very dense wood, so it would make a very dense biochar. Um, and I don't have any straight answers on which ones. We tend to just use what comes out of our coppice areas, so that will be hazel or sycamore or silver birch.
Thanks, Mark. So someone did mention actually hornbeam as well, and we're asking about the
Yeah.
density of the sort of the source material and whether that has an impact then on biochar. There's another question here: what's percentage of biochar to incorporate into the growing medium? I guess if you're going to be mixing it maybe with compost, or you'd actually mentioned sort of different layering of beds and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, they say that the first 10% is the most effective. But obviously, it's quite an expensive product. But I've actually grown trials with 75% biochar, so they'll work. But they feel that realistically, it's the first 10% that will make change to your soil.
Okay. Uh, does the presence of inorganic fertilizer have a negative impact on biochar?
Um, if it's a stable carbon, I'm not sure it would directly have an effect, but obviously it's going to affect the level of soil organisms that are going to be utilizing that area. Um, but as a fairly pure carbon, I don't think it will have an effect. If you've got it as inert and as stable by having a good temperature as possible, then it's not going to be reacting to anything.
Got you. Next one then is there any evidence that obtaining woodland material, for example, from the pine wood to inoculate biochar specific to growing pine seedlings, or from the birch wood for birch seedlings, is of greater benefit than other methods of charging the biochar? So I think that means, if
Yeah.
you're growing pine, should you use biochar from pine?
I think that's a really interesting concept. It'd be fascinating if there was a magic around that. I think the only thing that would be is if the pore size attracts the right sort of microorganisms. But my general view is because you've gone through a process of charcoal making at 500 degrees, you are really down to a carbon. The only difference that we've got is the different internal structure sizes of the pores in the different timbers. So my gut feeling would be it's unlikely to relate to its own species and its seed, really. But that's an interesting question.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, definitely there could be a lot of research done there. And uh, the person is wondering about incorporating biochar into the tree planting stage with their volunteers. So should they sprinkle the biochar on the surface, or put it down the notch? And if so, how much and what quantity makes a difference?
Okay, so I think first of all, you want to try and treat it. So it means you'll be putting a wet product in. So whether it's soaked in a comfrey liquid or a compost tea, you don't want to be putting in neat. If you're notch planting, you just need to be careful. So what we learnt was that the biochar is better if it's put below a plant so that the plant goes and finds it with its own root system rather than the root system being surrounded by biochar. So if you're pit planting or whatever, that's okay because you could like we put some in the bottom and then you could put a handful of compost on top or mix it in with a bit of compost. Or I mean, if for ordinary slip planting and notch planting, I think it's going to be a bit trickier to make sure that it doesn't get too close to the roots at the start. My thoughts are that we should be looking at inoculating our soils to increase the fungal stuff before we even start planting anyway. So there's some questions around how we treat what's generally pasture and make it a fit place to be growing trees in by increasing the fungal ratio, whether through mixtures of wood chip with biochar, with mycelium, these sorts of things. So biochar will have a role in it, but otherwise it would be about producing a feed from within the biochar, and that should be just below the root systems.
Okay, thank you. A few questions here. A couple of, I guess the practical ones is what kind of capital spend is required for biochar kilns, and how should biochar be stored, and how long can it be stored for?
Okay, yeah. So the kilns, I mean, if you want to do a double barrel burn, you basically just need to track down two different types of oil, about two sizes of oil barrel. So one can go in the other. The Contiki cost us about £1,000 because it's got to be rolled as a 3 mil steel. So I think we had a blacksmith who made it for us, but more than 50% of what he charged went to just some very technical steelworks that were able to roll a cone in effect and then cut the bottom off it. I've got a friend that's just built an octagonal one to mock up like that out of simple plate. But also we've got one that's producing at 700 litres, so that's quite a lot of stuff at a time. And the second part of the question was,
The second part of the question was how should biochar be stored, and how long can it be
okay,
stored for?
yeah. Okay, so biochar, like charcoal, will go wet and dry with different humidities, but it's not really a problem. Charcoal for cooking, if it gets wet, it's a bit of a pain. But for the biochar, it doesn't really matter. So I'll often store it in a tank full of comfrey liquid, so it's soaking in and out. Um, if it's quenched, then it's coming to you slightly wet anyway. We did go through the process of drying it in greenhouses and stuff like that with sun, but you can actually work with biochar with various moisture contents. The main issue for me has been packaging, because if we're putting it into paper rather than plastic, it needs to be as dry as possible, or cardboard. And so if we are selling treated biochar, then it means it's got to be in plastic. So I think you'll see these days there's plastic buckets with it available in, or it's in plastic bags inside cardboard boxes. So it will breathe, it will change, it will take up the moisture content by its very nature. So I'd store it inside, but I wouldn't be too worried about where it's stored particularly. And if things go to live in it, then hopefully that's great as well.
Okay, makes sense. Let's see. I think you sort of touched on this already. Is there any type of wood that isn't good or produces poor structural quality? For example, non-native conifer forestry compared to native hardwoods?
I think the conifers, there's a bit of a complication because the level of resins in them, even when they're dried, as to how it will affect the heat. And we were hoping to look at whether we could actually make biochar on a big scale from forestry waste. So until the wood chip industry became huge for biomass, obviously a lot of it was left on the land, and we thought it was good to be able to make that into a biochar and put it back on the land to help retain moisture, to stop soil erosion and that sort of thing, and to develop a better forest soil before they plant it again. So you could make softwood biochar out of it. Uh, I tend to feel that it's better with our traditional British hardwood trees. Realistically, there are some people making it out of rhododendron. It's very dense. I haven't found any references yet, but I suspect the pore sizes will vary on the denser timbers, as we mentioned, hornbeam as well, and wych elm and any English elm. You know, those denser timbers. I suspect it's going to be different, but no one's looking enough at the microorganisms that can live in it as to whether it's critical. But in terms of processing it, it's quite tricky, I find, to work with a conifer.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Uh, could biochar reduce nutrient runoff from tree nurseries or from a tree nursery?
Yes, so that's what I was thinking with the forestry thing. That's so when you have a clear fell site and you get all that soil loss and runoff, then I think biochar on the surface would do well there. And I think if you looked at, remember the drawing of the Stockholm idea, you could actually dig a pit if you wanted to and fill it full of biochar. You can leave it on the surface. I think it's better in the ground. Um, if you're having runoff, then I also think you need to be considering whether you've got significant compaction or you've got clay pans or what's going on with your soils as well as just biochar, because it'd be quite an expensive option to dig a pit all the way around and hold it. Um, so probably need to look at the whole soil as part of that as well as introducing biochar to it.
Okay, thank you. And someone here's asking, is it effective at filtering or removing urban surface water contaminants? If so, and if used for urban trees, might it concentrate those contaminants in the root zones? I'm not sure if that's within
Yeah.
your scope
So
of.
well, there was a project in West Newcastle where they used our biochar and they put it in the urban area. They put it on top of the soil to see if it could pick up some of the pollutants from passing cars and things like that. And it certainly does. I'm not sure with surface water. I mean, it's going to it's going to hold water, but then it's also going to release it. So if you look at that Stockholm idea, storm waters will come through and they'll flow through it fairly quickly. I'm not sure it's going to capture that much. So the charcoal ranges from a very broad hole through to things as tight as graphene and stuff like that, which will be used in water filters, which are for water purification. That's a very, very small hole, and that's made at a very, very high temperature. So really, we're talking about horticultural product primarily, that's going to serve the purposes for nutrients and water retention and release for us. So it's a very different thing if we start to look at contaminants at a range of levels coming that are coming through our streets or in our rainwater.
Okay, so this again, there's more research to be done there.
Yeah.
Um, we Another question from Ellie. How much biochar do you need for growing in terms of liters, and how much does for say one tree produce? They're just trying to understand what scale you would need to produce it on, if you would end up having a lot left.
Sorry, so you mean in terms of growing biomass to make into biochar?
Yeah, I guess how much
Yeah,
biomass do you need to make into
yeah, okay.
biochar?
Yeah, so my view is that we only use the top of the trees, the stuff that really isn't any good for anything else. I do have a picture in the talk, but I didn't put it in tonight. So we have a thing called a branch logger, which is actually like a chipper, but it throws out pieces of wood about 6 to 8 inches long from anything up to 2 inches in diameter. And so that's the sort of stuff that we would be using to make the biochar. And that would feed into a net and we'd store it for a year. But again, it's about the waste wood. So we're restoring hazel coppice. I'm tempted to be maybe going through the willow biomass with it, but we haven't done that particularly yet, because we've always had a home for our biomass. And to me, it's about using a waste product and making it into something useful rather than commercially growing a biomass product to make into biochar. So, I mean, we put 700 litres is the kiln when it's full. Um, I'd have to do some maths on that. From my side, it's where are we at? So I think we use about 42 nets of material when we're doing a burn, because obviously that's the nice thing if you use a Contiki, an open kiln like that, is you just load it and it burns down, makes the char, you load more, and so it stacks during the whole day's process rather than it just sitting there as a fixed batch process. It means you're continually feeding it, and so you can get a lot out of it. But in terms of volumes, I'd hope that people are just using waste wood that doesn't really have a benefit for anything else except for maybe wood chip.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, Ellie then came back in the chat to say that they would be looking to process rhododendron as they have lots. So I
Okay.
guess same thing. If you have a waste product like that, then it would be a good way to use it up.
Yeah, and I think if you make sure you're putting it at a high temperature, then some of the toxins that are associated with things like rhododendron and stuff that make it very acidic, they should go up in the with the volatiles as long as you're making it at the right temperature. I would encourage people not to be making it in traditional charcoal ring kilns, though.
And is that to do with the different burn type in the charcoal kiln?
Yeah, yeah. So in the ring kiln, you'll only get up to about 300 degrees, whereas in a Contiki or some of the other retorts that you can get up to 500 degrees, and so you're getting a better burn. It gets rid of the volatiles, and so it makes it a better product to put back in the soil. The Victorians used to put charcoal into their compost in the autumn and stuff like that, and so people felt that any charcoal was good charcoal, but we're aware now that not all charcoal is great for the planet in terms of whether it's stable enough and inert enough to sit in the soil. And some of it, if it's at a lower temperature, will still have some volatiles in it that you'd only seen get burnt off when you're getting up past 500 degrees C.
Okay. Uh, let's see. Alana was asking, are there any tree species in particular that seem to enjoy and benefit from the addition of biochar, or any that don't particularly like or benefit from it that you're aware of?
Not in the way of trees, because obviously the biochar really its relationship in the soil is fairly rigid. What it's doing is supporting the capture and release of the nutrients in the water. So it's most of the trees would like it, and maybe a tree that wants it really wet or really dry, maybe. But I'd have thought it should all work together the right way. I mean, I know with food growing, for instance, onions, the allium family didn't really like it at all. But tomatoes, cucumbers, and lots of other things, and the kales, they're all fine with it. But tree species, I think it's a bit of a different game because it's a stronger woody root system, and it just wants to make sure it's got the right nutrients around it. So you're providing that habitat for the creatures that can bring the nutrients, and you've got the spaces for the nutrients to be stored and released along with the water. So I think it should balance itself out.
Okay. I guess this is kind of connected in a way as well. Then is the question from Anthony: does it have any effect on the nitrogen fixing trees like alder? Any influence on the activity of the rhizobium?
I wouldn't have thought it should do because obviously that's going with the small things that are invading the roots of the tree and creating the nodules within the root system of the tree. Um, and because again it's keeping the balance in the soil of the right things around, I don't feel it should have any effect. But we can't be 100% sure on things. But so far, as a fairly inert substance, its task seems that it shouldn't really cause any negative problems to most things as long as it's made the right way.
Okay, thank
Sorry,
you.
it's not a great answer, but we have to go back to the simplicity of what we believe it's best for and how it's best produced, really, to see the most of it.
Gotcha. Yeah. So it's I guess very much used for the structure of the soil as opposed to kind of adding nutrients to the soil itself.
Yeah, it's definitely not a nutrient. It's definitely a carbon, but it becomes a home for nutrients and a home for the creatures. Yeah, I think that's the thing to remember. That's why it's a soil structure improver as opposed to a soil improver.
Gotcha. Thank you. Okay, I think that's the all the questions that were in the chat. If anyone else has any final questions, do please pop them into the chat there. I see Alana had asked earlier if anyone was already using biochar with growing trees, and there seems to be a few replies there, which is a good sign. So hopefully, yeah, that started a few conversations there and a bit more knowledge sharing and experience being put around. So that's exactly what we want to see. There's a question from Anne. Then is when we charge the biochar, is the aim to add nutrients or the microorganisms?
Well, you're adding nutrients primarily, because so you're soaking it in something to go into the soil, but often you'll find that people will then mix it with worm casts or something else. So you're getting, or with compost teas. So it's a bit of a mixture. For us, it was primarily about adding the potassium and the nitrogen into the soil through using comfrey liquid. But you can choose a whole recipe of your own that you, as you understand of what your soil needs and how it should work, and use the biochar as a carrier of that stuff to keep it in a balance in the soil. And it's to reduce the risk of the biochar getting nutrient hungry and taking things out of the soil. So you're putting something into it for it to go in with, and then the natural exchanges will happen with the microorganisms already in the soil, and obviously that are going in with any biochar tea or anything like that.
Okay, and yeah, I guess Gareth kind of relates to that in terms. He says that for trees, the main benefit of biochar would probably be from inoculation with beneficial mycorrhizae, which will then aid with establishment on planting out. So
Yeah,
that's
I mean, mycorrhizae seems to be pretty good, and I mean, they haven't particularly mixed it with biochar as such at the moment, but there's a company in Scotland that's working a lot with mycorrhizal pellet type stuff to put into the soil. But for me, mycorrhizal is only one part of the soil food web, and it's obviously a great part for the primary connection of the root system. But actually, the roots of trees need all sorts of nutrients and all sorts of creatures to be bringing that up to them. So it the mycorrhizal is a good start, but I think we need more than that. And also, I think for me, especially at the tree nursery stage, it's about keeping a balance in the water and making sure that we're not ending up with flooding from clay or losing water through sand. So it's about making sure the trees have enough water, hopefully, with us watering them less.
okay. Yes, Claire had asked questions earlier, and I missed them, so apologies, Claire. But what is activated charcoal? And then can the smoke or even the heat of the fire be used for other purposes? For example, heat bench in a propagation tunnel. I guess it can be, but
Yeah, so activated charcoal, that's not my field really. That's quite a heavy area, and I don't know how that works, so I wouldn't want to comment on that. But yes, I think it's Aston, the university are working with Birmingham, and they are using all the wood waste that's coming from the tree surgery gangs, and they're making biochar out of it, and the heat is being used in their polytunnels as well. And there's a great film called The Need to Grow, and that focused on a thing called the Big Green Dragon. And I don't know if people have seen it, but it was about a big pyramid that the guy was making biochar at the back and then using it and using the heat to heat this amazing system in America somewhere. For me, it's just with the Contiki system, it's very hard for us to capture the heat without affecting the burn, and we don't want to affect the burn. Um, but there are other systems, other pyrolysis systems that are fully enclosed that can capture the heat and utilize it for other things.
thanks, Mark. Let's see. Um, Anne is asking how long the nutrient charging benefit lasts. So I guess how long the biochar will be performing for once you put it in the ground.
Well, in theory, it should keep performing. Obviously, the first thing it does is it will be slowly releasing what you've put into it. But our evidence was that if we fed our tomatoes, they would capture more of the liquid as it went down through the root system and then held it. So they will continue to do the work by the very nature of it being in there. So its life of 10,000 years isn't just as a lockdown of carbon, but it's as that part of soil structure, allowing the interchange between the microorganisms and the nutrients and stuff like that continually. So what it's doing is providing a huge porous surface in the soil in so many ways that allows things to cling to them and shed between them. It's providing an extra structure to that soil for a long time.
Yeah, sounds like 10,000 years is quite a bit of time to be working. Yeah, okay.
Hope so.
Yeah. Um, okay, I think we'll finish off with Elizabeth's question, which is what references would you start to, or would you suggest to start with? So, is there any books? I think you mentioned a film or a video there. Is there any kind of references that you would use as a beginner?
Um, yeah, well, so there's some various names. There's Kathleen Draper. and Albert Bates in America. They've written some interesting books. I think Biochar Revolution. There's one just come out by Kelpie Wilson that I picked up at the Oxford Real Farming Conference. That's come over from America as well. I can't remember what that's called. It's probably the Biochar Handbook. Um, there's a thing called Burn, which has come out. I think that's Kathleen Draper. There's the Biochar Solution. To be honest, if you type biochar into eBay, I tend to pick up a lot of books that way. I'd go for the smaller, less technical books first. But Albert Bates wrote a really good book. And I'm trying to think off the top of my head who else at the moment. But there's some big, deep volumes and tomes of educational and research work as well, but they're quite tricky, really.
Okay, well, some good suggestions there. I took a note of some of them myself as well. So yeah, I'm sure people will be interested to get hold of those books. Seems to be a bit of a conversation going on in the chat about mycorrhizal colonization, which is a completely different topic. Maybe we'll at some point be able to do a webinar on that, but that's not really for tonight's chat. But yeah, the film name, what was the name of the film you'd mentioned? Sorry, someone was asking.
Yeah, The Need to Grow. It's a really interesting American film. And it's several different projects, but one of it's called the Green Powerhouse, and this is a guy called Michael Smith, I think it is, and it's about his big project. It was quite sad because it burns down and stuff like that, and they're not quite sure why, but it's a really interesting concept of mega scale biochar production and to feed the planet. Yeah, someone's just put in the Need to Grow Michael Smith. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
perfect. Thanks, Claire. Okay, I think we can wrap it up there. Mark, thank you very, very much for a great presentation and then for answering all those fascinating questions as well. You deserve a rest after that, and especially for battling through the technical difficulties as well.
Yeah.
I think everyone, would join me in thanking you for your great work tonight. So thanks to everyone who came along this evening. We provide these events just to share the knowledge and to provide the opportunity for people to come along, learn more and ask questions, which is what it's all about. As I say, we have an open space session on the 11th of February. If you have any further questions or anything else you'd like to talk about or chat about. And then we will be having a webinar on the 11th of March on funding. So yeah, it just once again just leaves me to thank Mark very, very much for this evening, and thank you all for coming along. And I hope to see you all again very, very soon. Good night.